Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and this book was wild. This is my review of Changes by Jim Butcher. This is the 12th book in the Dresden Files series, and my thoughts today are going to be a bit all over the place because this book was just crazy and a lot to talk about, so you're going to have to bear with me, but let's just get into it. So this video is going to start off being relatively spoiler free, save for a couple things that you may need to know just to understand kind of the concept of the story, but I'm going to do my best to avoid spoilers until I do get to a spoiler section, and I'll put a tag up on screen so you can skip past that if you haven't read the book. So if you haven't read the Dresden Files, it's essentially a fantasy slash mystery thriller noir detective fiction mashup that follows a private investigator named Harry Dresden who solves crimes in Chicago, who also happens to be a wizard. And the crimes or the mysteries that he has to solve kind of brush up against the supernatural and magical side of things. And this is a long series. I mean, this is book 12, and it's a series that for me has gotten increasingly better as it goes along. So I'm excited to talk about this one, especially with the hype surrounding this book in particular. Book 12 picks up a little while after book 11, as is usually the case in these series. They kind of take place a year after each one, and the main character, Harry, his life is upended when a very old ally, someone we haven't seen in a while, and the Red Court of Vampires intrude on his life in a very unique way, and he's sent on a search for a person he didn't know existed, and this search could potentially change the scope of his entire life and the magical community at large. And that's all I kind of want to say about the plot. If you haven't read Changes, I would suggest going and reading it as soon as possible, and if you have, just be patient for the spoiler section because I'll get into details then. Throughout my reading of this book, I kept thinking of another book in particular and how they had kind of similar arcs, and their position in the series kind of changed things, you know, not to make a pun about the title. That book was The Goblet of Fire. And that book in the Harry Potter series is notorious for kind of changing the paradigm or the direction of the series. You know, if you haven't read The Goblet of Fire and know what happens in that one, I'm sorry, it's been out for so long, but Voldemort comes back and it changes the entire scope of the series, and things are just never the same from that point. And throughout my reading of this book, that's all I kept thinking about. Things are never going to be the same for the characters in this series, and I'm very curious to see how the stakes are going to ramp up and how things are going to change for Harry in particular going forward. I think this may have also been the best book in the series, I'm not too sure. I think Deadbeat is still my favorite, and that's the one I'm comparing it up against. That one was just so fun and found a great blend of the mystery detective elements with the fantasy stuff. This book leaned a bit more into the fantasy stuff, which if you've seen my Dresden Files video, you know that I'm more into the mystery-oriented ones as opposed to the fantasy ones. But I thought that this book did such a good job establishing its own story and its own world building. The ones that I haven't liked as much, I think it's more the fault of the author trying to set up stuff outside of the story rather than focusing on its own plot. But in this case, Changes was so laser focused on telling its own tale, and I found that the blend, even though it went more into the fantasy side later on, was good enough for me to consider it maybe the best in the series. And the hype really didn't lie. I knew things were going to get messed up in this story and that it was going to change the scope of things a little bit, but not to the level I expected. I thought there may be like, you know, a third act reveal of something that changes the whole scope of the story, but I didn't think that literally from line 1 that things would never be the same. I opened up this book and screamed, what the hell? And I was hooked from there. Things were just thrown into chaos right away, and I think this is the highest stakes story, not necessarily because of the size of the action. I think there have maybe been bigger action set pieces in the story, but the emotional and personal stakes for Harry and his allies. Harry's been in some pretty dangerous high stakes situations in the past, like in Deadbeat, and more recently in Turncoat. I thought that the antagonist in that story was actually very dangerous compared to some of the other ones, but the stakes here were so much higher because of the personal aspect to Harry. To be fair, this isn't the first time that somebody close to him has been threatened. That was a huge plot point of Deadbeat as well. I also enjoyed that this one finally paid off a lot of the early plot lines that were set up in the series, the stuff that I previously complained about that were taking away from individual stories. A lot of that stuff gets wrapped up here. But so many elements of the story that have been built up over the previous 11 books before this were finally paid off, And in going through this story, it felt like watching a season finale of a TV show. All the subplots and the B plots and the characters that were introduced along the way were coming into play and affecting the story. A lot of character decisions were coming to a key point. There was a lot of stuff that Harry had to decide to do, which would change the course of his life in order to complete his goal in this story. And the decisions he did make are going to have repercussions throughout the rest of the series. And in talking previously about my struggle with, liking the mystery side a bit more than I like the fantasy side of this series, I think at this point I'm willing to accept that the series is going to be more fantasy oriented going forward. And he did the fantasy side so well in this book, and it seems like that's where the remainder of the series is maybe going to go and lean a bit more into, and I just have to accept that and be okay with it. Changes did such a good job though that I can't be mad at that decision. It also makes more sense for the character of Harry to get more into the fantasy elements as he's been growing in his powers and skills as a wizard since the beginning. His involvement in the world is growing and his role is becoming more and more important as each book goes along. So to get more entrenched in the fantasy side, I'm kind of ready for. And in speaking of where the series is going, I really don't know where it can go after this. I'm not going to say anything about the ending right now, but it leaves a lot of thought to be had about where it's going to go going forward. If I thought that, 99% of the book was a mind leading up to that ending, I really don't know where it's gonna go. Well, I kind of know where it's gonna go a little because I'm a bit way into Ghost Story, the next book in the series, so I have kind of an idea. All right, that's it for my general thoughts about the book changes, and now I'm gonna get into my spoiler section. So if you have read the book or just don't care, continue on from here. But if you haven't, look at the time I put on screen and skip to that point. So now that I can talk details, I just wanted to confirm and kind of count out the amount of storylines that come to a head here and are paid off, and I'm gonna have to list these. So there's Susan Rodriguez and the whole thing about her being turned into a vampire, which has been, a subplot since book 3, so it's been a while, and the whole thing about her and Harry's relationship kind of coming to a head with them having conceived a child, I guess in death masks, and that threw him for a loop, it threw me for a loop, and I just didn't know where the story was going to go from there, and it was so exciting. There's also Mab's desire to ensnare Harry as the Winter Knight, which is something she's been trying to do since we were introduced to her character in Summer Night, and to see that finally paid off here, and Harry making that decision to gain the power of the Winter Knight to accomplish his goals here was both tragic but also really exciting at the same time. I guess that even might have started a bit earlier because the transfer of power or ownership that they kind of have over Harry started with his godmother in book 3 as well, so that was even earlier. You got Harry and Murphy's sexual tension, which was so close to being paid off, and of course it was snatched away from him as soon as that was gonna happen. And in the page leading up to that exciting and cliffhanger ending, I knew something bad was gonna happen because that moment was just too good for Harry and Murphy. It had to be taken away. The Grey Council kind of getting involved for the first time and showing their face outside of Ebenezer and Harry, and they had that great Han Solo moment where they come in to save the day, and I thought it was really well earned. I don't really like Deus Ex Machina when it's not earned in that way. I like when it's tied to a character arc or a character decision, and their decision to kind of finally make a stand and help Harry out, and to learn that Ebenezer was his grandfather as well, was really exciting and sort of a payoff to their relationship that's been growing over the course of the series. And then there's Molly, who finally got to demonstrate her full abilities in the final battle, and we got to see the kind of wizard she's becoming. She's different from Harry. She doesn't necessarily have the battle prowess that he does, but her character is different, and I think is a nice reflection of Harry to show what a wizard is when he teaches them versus kind of the way he is. And of course we get the final payoff for the Red Court. This is a plot line that has been in the books since the first one, with Harry's interaction with Bianca the vampire. So starting from that moment where he kind of wrongs her, to her getting back at him and starting the war in book 3, and then all the back and forth that has been happening since. And although the Red Court has kind of been more in the background since about, I guess, book 5-ish, it was nice to see them become the main villain again in a story and affect it directly, because it had been so long and it's something we've been hearing about in every book. To be honest, the Red Court of Vampires haven't necessarily been my favorite villains in the series. I think there are ones that are much more engaging and scarier. I think the White Court is much more interesting, and I thought that the Necromancers in Deadbeat and the Skinwalker in Turncoat were more threatening necessarily than the Red Court, although the Red Court is maybe had the greatest influence over the series in their role in this giant war, but they haven't been the most compelling for me. They were well handled in this book, I'll say that. They were threatening. I kind of missed their monstrous animalistic nature, you know, being so used to the White Court of Vampires, them being so prevalent in the books in between. And to see this storyline of the war, which I thought was started maybe too early in the series. At that point, I was still into that groove of the pulpy, you know, self-contained detective fiction stories. That to them open and blow up the world that early in book 3 seemed a bit much to me. And to have that, you know, slowly pay off over the books and come to a head here was actually kind of nice. And I think the fact that the war is over now is going to create a more compelling story and maybe create a vacuum for other factions or villains to rise up. So I'm not too mad about the convenience of destroying them all at once, because I think more interesting things might pop up in the future. So that's it for my review of Changes. It was, you know, a bit short. I could talk about this forever, it feels like, considering the amount of stuff that went down in this book. But let me know in the comments if you've read Changes. Were you kind of as messed up and taken aback as I was when you first went through the book? I have started Ghost Story. I'm about, I think, 10% of the way through the audiobook, and I discovered that this was the version that wasn't narrated by James Marsters. It was narrated by John Glover. He's actually doing a pretty good job, although I gotta say I was a little confused and I almost didn't want to listen to it when I first discovered that the library's version wasn't the one with the usual narrator. But I'm making my way through it and he's actually doing okay, so I'm gonna continue with this one, and I think for the rest of the books going forward, I am gonna just listen to the audiobooks. So that's it for now. Remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing, leaving a comment. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.